The Russian Revolution of 1917 brought a revolutionary change from a dictatorship led by czars to a country led by communism. This led to the Soviet Union and a model of communism for the rest of the world. Before 1917, there was a small educated class and a badly trained army. Because of this, Russia lost in a war to Japan, which lowered the already suffering economy. The Russian citizens protested about the economy and life conditions in Russia, creating the 1905 revolution. Many workers peacefully went to the Tsar's palace in St. Petersburg for help. The workers were shot, and hundreds were killed. In 1914, Russia joined World War I against the German troops, even though there was no direct threat to Russia. 8 million Russians were killed, wounded, or captured. Before 1917, living conditions were also very bad. 2/3 of the country's homes lacked sewage systems and running water. The roads were unpaved, and the garbage was left in the streets uncollected. The factories also had harsh conditions. The adults worked around 11 hours a day, and the kids worked around 8 hours every day. The factory's workers were exposed to dangerous chemicals without ventilation or masks. Because of these conditions, the mortality rate was low, and the working class consisted of disease, poverty, and sickness. The Bolsheviks were a political group believing in communism. The Mensheviks and SR's, Socialist Republic, were very similar to the Bolsheviks. All three of these groups wanted a new government with a classless society. They all wanted communism, but their beliefs within that were altered. The Bolsheviks were led by Lenin. They had a secret police called the Cheka, which ensured that while the Bolsheviks were in power, they stayed in power. While ruling in the 1920s, many lived in fear to even mention a dislike about the Bolsheviks. Many were killed or put into jail for anti-Bolshevik beliefs. The Provisional Government was a form of government that began after the February Revolution. They were not stable and had no power. The Provisional Government represented the upper class and liberal reformers, whereas the Bolsheviks represented the workers and soldiers, even though they both claimed to represent the entire nation. Communism was a major part of the Bolshevik beliefs. The goal of communism is to have a classless society, meaning there was no rich nor poor, according to the teachings of Karl Marx.
That Lenin and the Bolsheviks forced, basically, through a lot of propaganda and through fighting, the revolution to occur in a country that had just started to experience capitalism. It was a backwards nation. And so most people in Russia had never experienced capitalism before, and they needed to, according to Marx, experience it, give it a try before they would be ready to move on to communism.
During 1917, events occurred right after another. To start the new year, on January 1st, 1917, the Russian troops defended Riga from the Germans. The Russian troops were in bad conditions. 1.5 million soldiers left the army to feed their families. 50% of all the soldiers were farmers. This led to mass shortages of food. On January 9th, the Bolsheviks raised their numbers to 24,000 people. They organized a demonstration in remembrance of Bloody Sunday. 30,000 workers went on strike in Moscow and another 145,000 people in Petrograd. Many other cities went on a one-day strike in cities such as Nizhny, Novograd, Novocherkassk, Voronezh, Kharkov, Rostov-Don, and many other cities. On January 31st, Petrograd has little to no food. The stockpile of flour will only last for 10 more days, and there is no more meat. Crowds of mainly women break into stores for food. The February Revolution, also called Bread Riots, began. 128,000 demand peace in World War I, an increase in food, and an increase in oil. The women in Petrograd invade bakeries and shops for food to feed their children. On February 24th, the demonstration doubles its size. 200,000 workers break into police stations and cut telephones to government officials. Many were killed or wounded because of armed fights with the police. General Kabalov's soldiers, under the Tsar's orders, opened fires on the strikers. 169 people were killed and another 1,000 people were injured. The Bolsheviks created the revolutionary movement, but the Mensheviks had more power. The newly elected Provisional Committee urged Tsar Nicholas II to share his throne with the Prime Minister, but Nicholas refused. On February 28th, the Tsar's ministers were arrested, and the Provisional Committee is put in charge of the army. On March 2nd, Tsar Nicholas II left his throne, monarchy was defeated, and a new provisional government formed. They tore down the Tsar's statues. The Pravda is republished after being closed down for its main focus to end World War I. The political prisoners were then forgiven and let free. On March 16th, people declared that they wanted the war to end. On March 27th, the provisional government decided that for Russian safety, they were continuing the war. On April 20th, people decided that after Milakov promised the Russian army would stay in war till victory, that not just Milakov, but the whole provisional government should be overthrown. On June 3rd, the first All-Russian Congress decides to end the war. On June 21st, the Piltalo and 70 other factories went on strike in favor of the Bolsheviks. 80,000 workers and soldiers marched to the Tahrir Palace wanting a Bolshevik government. On July 4th, 4 of 5 workers joined demonstration totaling 500,000 people. 400 were killed or wounded. On July 5th, the Pravda was destroyed and the workers distributing newspapers were murdered in the streets. If you mentioned Lenin or the other Bolsheviks, you would be arrested. This created all-around fear throughout Russia, but 120 Kronstadt sailors did not give in. The Red Guards defended them, but they had to disarm for a passageway back home. In the last 5 months, 568 enterprises lay off more than 104,000 workers. The prices in Russia have risen 248% since 1913, and the wages have fallen 57.4%. In Moscow, only 2 pounds of bread is given per person for an entire week. On August 28th, the Kornilov and his most loyal officers decide to hang all the Bolshevik and Soviet members. The next day, Kornilov's army arrives in Petrograd's train station, but the workers delayed the trains. To prevent Kornilov, the rail workers tear up the tracks and the postal and telegraphic workers hold military communications. Finally, on August 30th, the Kornilov army was defeated. On October 24th, the October Revolution began. The Red Guards, led by Trotsky, controlled the bridges and roads into the city, controlled the General Post Office, the Nikolvasky and the Baltovsky train stations, the power stations, and the State Bank central telephone. By 2 a.m. the next day, there was a new government. The provisional government collapsed because even though they did manage to give people more freedom, it did not provide food, education, and other things they promised from the beginning. The government collapsed because they were not organized like the Bolsheviks. They did not have the support of the people, hence they were seen by the people as a continuation of the old regime. They had a little authority and power to make necessary changes, says Jade Walsh, the president of the Russian Club of Jackson Hole. After the revolution, Russia began a civil war. The Reds wanted Bolsheviks, and the Whites wanted an anti-Bolshevik government. The Reds won, creating the Soviet Union in 1922. Lenin died a year later, and Joseph Stalin took over. Stalin was very cruel. In the late and middle 1920s, Stalin did not tolerate his people opposing him. He killed thousands of his own people and sent many more to labor camps. In 1991, the USSR dissolved and democracy formed. The revolution reformed society because in the beginning, Tsar Nicholas II was a clueless leader. And the people had a right to stand up for themselves. The Russians had a bad leader and there was nothing they could do to change that. Lenin revolutionized this by abolishing this theory. He made it so that the Russians could do something. Stalin ruined communism because of his cruel ways of ruling. But because of Lenin and the other Bolsheviks, they now have the necessary skills and power to stand up for themselves and overthrow Stalin, just like the Tsar, to have what the citizens thought was just.